O tēnā koutou katoa. Tēnei te mihi atu ki a koutou I hui hui mai nei I tēnei ata I Aotearoa I te pō ki tā wāhi. Tēnei te mihi atu ki a koutou nau mai hara mai ki tēnei o ngā whakawhiti kōrero mō he waka eke noa. Kia ora everyone and welcome to this webinar for He Waka Eke Noa. I realise that many people have registered and that the time is different, and so we're going to have a lot of people coming on later on to watch. We're broadcasting this out of Aotearoa at 9 o'clock in the morning, but coming from London at around 10 o'clock, and so we're really cognizant of the time difference that's happening, but we want to welcome everyone in. And please, as you know, the links to all of these webinars are shared later on, and please share them out to your communities, family, friends and co-workers. My name's Leonie Pihammer. I'm one of the principal investigators on the project, and we've been doing this webinar series now for a number of months as a way of sharing some of the information coming out of the project in terms of cultural approaches to violence prevention, intervention and healing. And so a part of what we've been doing is also encouraging the wider connectedness with our international relations around what is happening in other countries. And so today we're joined with by Professor Marai Larasi, and Betty Sio is going to do the introduction, but I just want to add my welcome to you today and thank you for joining us. So we're going to open with a karakia, and then I'm going to hand to Betty to do the opening introduction. Whakataka te hau ki te uru, whakataka te hau ki te tonga, kia mā kina kina ki uta, kia mā taratara ki tai. Ihi ake na te atakura he tio, he huka, he hauhu, ti hei mauri ora ki a tātou katoa. Kei a koe, Betty.
Kia ora, Leonie. Kia ora and talofa lava. Good evening, Professor Marai Larasi. Marai is of Black, African and Caribbean ancestry, a sister, and she joins us from London in the UK. And Marai is known for years, many years, and her extensive work in ending violence against Black women and girls, locally, internationally and globally. Marai spent some time in Aotearoa working alongside Indigenous women's groups, organisations, women's refugees, and she partnered up with the Pacific Island Safety and Prevention Project. Marai provided some training and was joined at some stage by Dorette Jones in providing support, contributing to the successful work of the project in addressing violence. Marai continued to work supporting Black and Indigenous communities. You know, she's a sister in the struggle, and I have the utmost pleasure in welcoming you also, sister, to our space today, and look forward to your sharing with us all. Susumai, talamai a'ao, honour and respect.
Kia ora. Ancestral and warrior greetings, beloved ones. So thank you, Leonie, like huge gratitude for in you and Fano inviting me into this space. It means so much. Betty, like I've just missed being in community with y'all, and I know this is virtual, but like really my heart and my belly are singing. I am a little bit nervous as well because it's been a long time since we've been in community in this way, and all the tech and everything, it feels different from when we'd be, you know, kind of sitting around in a hui. And so yeah, please bear with me as I go through the conversation. I'm also perimenopausal, so I might forget things. So I've got some notes. So I just want to acknowledge that all that I share today is grounded in shared labour. Is grounded in every conversation, including every hui, every caucus, every whānau, every moment we've had, the ways that we've made connections across our different journeys. So the day-to-day work, the mahi might be different, but the kaupapa is deeply connected. To give a sense of who I am, so I was born here in what some of us fondly call the People's Republic of London. I was born to Jamaican parents. I was raised in the mountains of Jamaica, where the soil is a deep, rich red, and like blood, it gives life and it stains. I'm a product of colonization, and it's important to say that up front. So like sugar, like rum, like modern tobacco, I carry this legacy in my body and in my psyche, and it's really important to kind of center that and to own that. It's not all that I am, but it's important to actually say that. So I carry that legacy of trafficking, of enslavement, of exploitation, hybridity, pain, survival, resistance, and more. So my ancestors are those unknown women and men and children that were ripped from the belly of Africa, forced to labour in European-owned plantations built on the lands of the indigenous Taino people, who had been almost wiped out by the Spanish invaders. My ancestors, complicatedly, are also some of those very Europeans who were the architects of this devastation. And that's what I mean when I talk about the complexity. So in that spirit, I invoke the presence of only those ancestors who journey with us with love and care across time and space, and who hold us in our day-to-day lives and in our dreams and struggles of collective liberation. I'm also vibing my sister Dorette, who has travelled this path with me. We've cried together, dreamed together. She couldn't be with us for this gathering as she's taken a much needed break, but she's with us in spirit. And deep gratitude to the band of troublemakers, disruptors, warriors that are my Black feminist community, my Black liberation community, my people. We're an untidy bunch. We are the dykes holding the lines, the disabled rebels who refuse to be erased, the queers who refuse to be straightened. We're the ones that they would have called the natives, and we're always the revolting kind, and we're really proud of that. So why Black feminist time travel? Because I really do believe this is our work. We believe this is our work. To retrieve fragments of memory that ground us in who we've been before the devastation of colonization, before our first contact. To dream and imagine liberated futures, and to craft our daily lives and our activism by weaving all of this together. So I'm going to share screen, and hopefully this works. Rami, if I do anything strange, you might need to intervene with me. Okay, so hopefully you can see that. So the pictures here are of two Jamaican women, Mary Seacole, who was a doctress in the Crimean War. Florence Nightingale hated her. Olive Morris, who was a Black feminist freedom fighter here in London in the 1970s. I call on them as reminders of Black women's presence and the dangers of erasure. So we, my community, my band of troublemakers, we're no longer willing to speak about the violence that we're subjected to in our intimate relationships, in our families, in our workplaces, without naming the colonial project and the unimaginable scale of violence that we have been subjected to, that we continue to be subjected to. So I have to take you on a little bit of a journey, and I'm going to ask you to bear with me. It's messy, but it's important. To begin to give a context to my work here and now, I have to give a context to who we are and how we came to be here. Most of the images we see of Africa today is of a continent of poverty, of famine, of devastation. I could say more about that, but to be honest, that's another event. So I want to introduce you to a little piece of Africa before first contact. A continent of millions of people from diverse empires, communities, nations, clans, tribes, families. Sometimes people who were actually at war with each other. Different languages, cultures, centers of learning, art everywhere. Art such as the Benin bronze, which is pictured there on the left. Maybe you're right. And that's actually sitting in the British Museum here. So I have to credit it. Please note, this is African art. And on this slide, I've got to actually credit the copyright to the trustees of the British Museum. The theft is ongoing. We were a community, we were communities with a whole range of different spiritual practices, from polytheistic religions with multiple deities to monotheistic belief systems such as Islam. Or deities include Allah, the supreme goddess in Igbo land, which is part of modern-day Nigeria. She's pictured there in the middle, and she holds a sword as well as a child. So we have been fighting, we have been understanding complexity for many generations. I think about Papa Legba, the trickster, who had many similar attributes to Maui. And one of the things to note in that, in the same way Disney was so disrespectful about Maui, the trickster, is the same way that Hollywood portrays Papa Legba as an ultimate evil conman. Africa, the map pictured there on the other side, in its diversity was as complicated and as rich as any other place. I'm not offering a pretense of utopia. But what I can say is that for the most part, we belong to the lands, the rivers and the mountains. Our bloodlines ran deep into the soil and we were home. So this is a really painful image to engage with. The Africa that the Europeans first, quote unquote, discovered. I've always been struck by this notion of European discovery. The Africa from which millions of people, humans, were stolen and trafficked across the Atlantic to the so-called New World, including the Americas and the Caribbean, was itself, it simply was Africa. The people of the land in the Caribbean, the people of the lands, example, in Jamaica, the Taino, were subjected to genocide through brutality or disease. Caribbean countries such as Guyana face the same kind of brutality, where indigenous people were driven further and further into the interior of the country. My ancestors were trafficked across the Atlantic in ships and stowed like sardines in much the ways that you see on the screen. The plantation, when they arrived, offered no relief from the slave ships. And it's important to note that women and children were not afforded special privileges. The plantation regime included physical assault, sexual violence as routine. Dehumanization was actually the cornerstone of the plantation economy. Africans, my ancestors, were simply work units. And it's important to remember that, it's important to know that, because that's how we were defined in those days, and that's how we continue to be defined in many ways in the European psyche. So we needed to function, but in many ways we were disposable. And like many other manifestations of colonization, slavery was entirely legal in the various European systems. So in the same way the English used their laws of terra nullius to claim land in Aotearoa, to claim land in Australia, it's the same way they use the idea of owning us as they used the idea of legality to justify owning us. An estimated 12 million humans were shipped, packed like sardines, for a journey which took several weeks. And the bones of approximately 2 million Africans lay in the sand as part of the Atlantic Ocean. Britain formally abolished the slave trade in 1807, but only outlawed slavery in 1834. And it wasn't until 1838, after 4 years of apprenticeship, that freedom came. So colonial plunder made Britain a superpower. And as we see from Aotearoa to Turtle Island, from Africa to the Indian subcontinent, from Guyana to Samoa, reparation and meaningful decolonization are phrases in the European dictionary, but very rarely an intentional practice. So let me share this in that vein. The British government paid the slave traders £20 million in compensation. 40% of its budget at that time. That's around £17 billion in today's money. The government actually took out a loan to pay the plantation owners, the slave traders, which was only paid off by British taxpayer money in 2015. That means that living taxpayers, including people like me, descended from enslaved people, helped to pay billions of pounds to slave traders to stop them from trafficking my ancestors, and to the people that owned my ancestors for their lost property and their loss of earnings. The British government used public money and paid the exploiters, but not those who were enslaved and their descendants. And it's also useful to note, sometimes in the complexity of feminist movement building, and in the complexity of our relationships as black women with white women, between 25 and 45% of claims were made by white women. Women were permitted to own black humans as property when they effectively had no other property rights in the UK. Yet we survived in the messy space of the Caribbean. We forged new cultures, we inserted words into the English language that we broke apart. You know, they say we speak broken English. We spoke to each other in drum beats, which were banned, by the way. We reconfigured Christianity through Voodoo and Obeah and Santeria, and we forgot and we remembered our deities. We became the guardians of the lands that we had been violently transported onto and transplanted onto. We planted umbilical cords on the trees, and we inserted our gods and our ancestors into children's stories. And when the so-called freedoms came, and there were new arrivals from India, from the Indian subcontinent, from China, we came together. And we reimagined what the Caribbean could be. We found ourselves with this forced hybridity. And new forms of heteropatriarchy were born in the pain. And the violence continued. So the truth is, we as African Caribbean women who arose from centuries of sustained violence, meted out into our bodies, our minds, and our very sense of being, have never been far away from violence. The pictures that are here, this picture of the ship, the Empire Windrush, is a really famous picture. In 1950s post-war Britain had been, like the war devastated Britain, World War II. And so it called on its colonies, yes, it called on empire to come and rebuild what it framed, the motherland. And many, like my parents, answered that call, partly because it meant opportunity, right? Training, education, and so forth. My mom had always wanted to be a midwife. This was an opportunity for her to be trained in the place where apparently you had the best midwifery training. But when they arrived, they were largely met with hostility, including from the very state that had invoked these ideas of coming and rebuilding the empire. So ideas of belonging to empire and belonging to this space were critical in terms of how the empire reconfigured itself. But the new version of the plantation was here on these islands. Policies to control immigration and to once again criminalize the black body were enacted. Race relations theory and policies defined us, Caribbean people, as having no culture to speak of. We were defined as mongrels. We were defined as actually not having real humanity. The manifestations of violence against us have been widespread and varied, too many to cover in any depth here. But many of the patterns that have played out in Aotearoa, from police violence to institutionalization, especially of black disabled people, will be familiar. As I said before, as African Caribbean women, we have never been far away from violence. But what do the everyday narratives and the everyday, like the common sense understanding of violence against women and girls tell us? So this is just a quote from a chapter that was written by my sister Dorette and I, where we assert that violence against women and girls here on these islands is defined in the realm of the individual and the interpersonal, based on incidents of violence at the hands of a known perpetrator, usually a male partner or a stranger, predatory individual operating outside of the agreed norm. Policy and programming practice priorities reflect which lives and bodies matter, which attitudes and behaviours are deemed harmful, and who is doing what to whom. Ideas of state-led or state-sanctioned violence, for example, the violence meted out through colonisation, is largely absent from the understandings of perpetration and victimisation. The brutality of racism and homophobia, the brutality of heteronormativity is often absent from discourses on violence against women and girls. Policy, programming, and common sense narratives around violence against women and girls have been dominated by domestic violence and limited to the idea of wife battering. And when we come to those of us who are melanated, when we come to those of us who are black, then what we have is an obsession by the state around things like forced marriage, in order to actually say that our communities are inherently more patriarchal, or female genital mutilation, in order to show that actually this is what they do to their girls. Yes, 100%, forced marriage and female genital mutilation are real issues, but there's an obsession around particular forms of violence against women and girls that help to prove and help to support the colonial ideas that we are somehow much more dangerous, that we are inherently dangerous, that the black body is fundamentally violent. And the quote there from Patricia Hill Collins is always a helpful reminder. The interpretation of any given act as violent lies not within the act itself, but in how powerful groups conceptualize it. So unsurprisingly, the state has not been our friend. Dorette and I, along with many other sisters, have found ourselves labouring in spaces that were not interested in protecting us. We found that women like us were constantly marginalised by white women, and even by other global majority women, other women of colour, or knowledge systems disregarded or activism erased, and once again, we were made to feel like work units. So this screen is intentionally black, which might be a peculiar thing to do, but I promise it'll make sense in a moment. So again, I'm going to recall words from the chapter, and by the way, I'm not plugging the book, it's simply because I don't want to be accused of plagiarizing myself. Okay, so begin quote. In our practice, space is a constant theme, expressed through nostalgia, longing, gratitude, and even regret. As black women, defiant post-colonial subjects, we seek and long for an imagined whole herstory that has been appropriated and recodified. As British African Caribbean women impacted by the ruptures of colonisation and post-Second World War migration, we hear echoes of this space from mothers, tanti, tanta, which is like a way of saying auntie, and grandmothers. This knowledge could not have remained intact, fully intact on that journey across the Atlantic during the slave trade, nor could it have entirely survived the hostility of the plantation or the trauma of arrival to Britain during the Windrush period. So many of us clutch at tiny fragments from our barely known past in an attempt to reclaim and rebuild what was lost. Black women speak of needing space, often with each other, to heal, to organise, to resist, and even just be. This is the significance of space as conceptual, experiential, and providing something. End quote. So I have to tell you that Dorette and I cried all the way through writing that chapter. In the presence of ancestors, in the presence of each other, we had to deal with how we had been in the work. We had to deal with how colonized we have been. We had to deal with how our different survival strategies as professionals had meant that we had denied ourselves as survivors. And so just to continue, as post-colonial subjects carrying within our very bodies and psyches the legacies of colonization, we're trained to think of Western scientific knowledge, including social science, as superior and reliable. We have been taught to trust while also fearing Eurocentric social work frameworks. Trust because we are the insider-outsider professionals. Fear because we are Black, African, Caribbean women who have been raised with an instinctive distrust of systems which constructed us, African Caribbean women, as social problems. There is a daily psychic violence that is done to self in holding this paradoxical position, and there is a violence that is done in the deconstructing of our professional selves. We also began a process of recall of that which has always been there in Black women's rituals, healing and connections. We reflected on women's healing circles, women's business and the barnyard. We noted the importance of consciousness raising groups in many feminist struggles. We shared journeys, memories, tears and food. We spent days. We cried with our sister Betty Sear from Aotearoa, our Samoan sister. We spent hours talking through the work. And our reimagination has taken us not to a place of solution, actually, but to one of inquiry. We have started rather than ended with what for us are building blocks, critical elements of reconstructing space. Our reconstruction, at its very essence, demands push, upheaval, nurture, and ongoing excavation. And so, coming from the chapter, we began to think about writing down our approach. We did what we know to do as Caribbean women, which is Tonwe Hannah McFashion, make something good out of nothing. And so what we did was we focused not on what we do, but we focused on how and why we do our work. And so we started to become more Talawa. And for those of you who love a bit of Bob Marley, you will know the Rasta colors there. Yeah, we do have the red, green, and gold and black right there. So Talawa is a Jamaican word which means strength. Much like Shiro, often used to refer to women who are not expected to be warriors. So women who are little but Talawa. In many ways, Talawa has resonance with Toa. So this simple image is where we landed, four overlapping interconnected elements rooted in an intersectional analysis and praxis. We were both working at IMCAN at the time, and we knew our sector could benefit from marking the boundaries of the work as distinct from white feminist practice, which engages heavily with criminal justice approaches. We were clear that our thinking wasn't new. This was just a reconceptualization of our work, rooting that allowed us to more clearly articulate what meaningful ending violence against women and girls practices for us. This wasn't a model, it was simply an approach. And maybe in the Q&A we can talk a little bit more about this, but there were some key things in this for us around speaking about by and for, so what it means to, it's the nothing about us without us piece, to make sure that we are centering ourselves in our practice, that actually the work is led by us, that we are critiquing, that we're planning, that we're strategizing, that we're dreaming together. That being the primary source. That we think about safety as disrupting systems of harm, that we engage with different systems of harm that are not just about a linear understanding of gender inequality, that are not just about a linear understanding of patriarchy, that we talk about ableism, that we talk about heterosexism, that actually we know that if we don't center disability justice, then actually there is no struggle, or struggle becomes meaningless. We know that actually if we leave the folk, that are queer, that are dykes, if we leave or trans communities behind, that actually our struggle is not complete. We also know that for us to think about safety, it means understanding crisis beyond the immediate. It means understanding crisis as spiritual crisis as well as physical crisis. We know that support means us having the right to choose who we work with, who supports us. We know that space means space to dream, space to dance, space to laugh. And we know that social justice cannot be found in criminal justice systems. And as the work has evolved, because that's necessary, one of the things that has been important has been for us to clear space for our ancestors to be present. Because even in the work, as we do the work, we recognize how much our ancestors, while they have been present, how much we have been forced to leave our ancestors behind. We also recognize the importance of rooting the work in smaller, carefully crafted, curated spaces in order to do deeper work. And critically, I'd say that Dorette and I have really, for ourselves, disrupted the idea and the practice of sector. So returning to the movement while at the same time valuing the labour of the folk that are helping to keep women alive. And I'm not going to spend too much time here, I'm almost done. But this approach, where we have been deliberate in rethinking harm, has had us think different, has had us evolve, has had us say, what are the contextual factors that we need to be aware of? And when we talk about contextual factors, that's our opportunity to think about women's journeys, think about women's pathways, think about Fano's sense of place or not, think about what it means in terms of who is in her life, think about how she knows her place or not. Those are the elements that we've started to integrate in different ways that take us, for us, closer to how we feel we need to be understood and closer to how we are helping to reimagine the world. And then just the last piece around the emergence of Talawa. So the other thing we started to understand was that our work needed resourcing. And so we are part of a really beautiful Black feminist collective that is literally reimagining and resourcing our work in different ways, because we want to reduce and absolutely limit and finally disconnect completely from the state. But that's another story. So the goddess Allah, who was pictured at the beginning, this is a futuristic reimagining of the goddess Allah. And so we like to say that our future is rooted in our past. We dare to be courageous. We dare to be courageous, loving ancestors. We ask ourselves all the time, what kind of ancestors do you want to be? We dare to practice our liberation. Somebody mentioned it to me quite recently as rehearsing our freedom. We dare to travel across time, space and borders. We dare to connect. There are men outside making really a lot of noise. I'm so sorry about this. So I'm gonna stop sharing now, and that's it for the minute. I have to say, I was looking at my screen and I couldn't see anybody, so it was the weirdest experience of just looking at my slides and going, I don't know if I'm making any sense.
Kia ora, Marai. That was an incredibly motivating and inspiring and insightful presentation, for which we are very thankful. And I know Betty had a question that we talked about earlier around the kind of connectedness. So I'm going to hand to Betty for her pātai. Kia ora.
Malo, awesome, Marai. That was, as usual. I wanted to ask a question around connectedness and why you might think it's important to, in terms of our connectedness across the oceans, and maybe talk about that, because I obviously felt it was really important, but it'd be nice to hear from you about that.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, the connectedness is what has us be here, right, in this conversation. And I think it's the thing that I said at the beginning, like the actual day-to-day mahi might be different, but it feels like the kaupapa is deeply connected. So when I first came to Aotearoa, the whole experience for me was deeply, deeply emotional, because I had this experience of being known, so first of all, I had to deal with the weirdness of how much people love Bob Marley, right? So I had to just get past the Bob Marley love. That was a real kind of thing where I was like, what is this thing where people are calling him Uncle Bob? What's that about? But then I realized that there was this connection in terms of our liberation struggles that I really did not know. I didn't know that reggae music was a thing in Aotearoa, for example. I didn't know the images of Aotearoa that come here are very much New Zealand images, right? They're very much like this laid back space for white folk, etc. The exoticization of tangata whenua, like literally. So there is no, I had no context, and I didn't know about the kind of the presence of, Samoan folk on the land and Tongan folk on, I didn't know. And then I got there and I was just like, this feels like home. This is super weird, right? I had this experience of being welcomed and held and loved by the crew at the project and by so many Maori sisters, and it helped me to find me, right? So again, it's like that thing of, in understanding and hearing about the struggles there and in relating to the struggles, I could also connect to my ancestral pathways and the struggles we had had. And in sharing and listening to what has been done, in terms of what people call settler colonization, which I knew about in terms of, say, Turtle Island, right? But in terms of understanding that and going, actually, the actual strategies are different and similar, but the same kind of impact on our people, right? Like the systematic nature of that violence, and then the ways the men in our communities are defined as inherently more violent, the way that our lives are deemed to matter less, like all of those things felt so familiar. And critically, like the level of defiance, that I was encountering with the Wahine, like it was like, yes, these are my sisters. I know, like this is familiar. So for me, we cannot have our collective liberation without us connecting. And what I would say is that colonizers are constantly connecting, right? Like the nation states are constantly connecting. And so we involved in the struggle, for our liberation to be meaningful, we have to be learning and we have to be connecting. And the last thing I would say is there's a brother called Robbie Shilliam who wrote a really beautiful book called The Black Pacific, where he spoke about the children of Legba and the children of Maui. And he spoke about the deep spiritual connections that exist between us. And I also I really do believe that our ancestors are somewhere connected and in conversation. And so for me, like this is simply us doing our ancestral work. So that was a very long answer, Betty, sorry.
That was an excellent answer. Thank you. And, you know, I think one of the other things around us reaching out to you and people like Bonnie and Betty and, you know, to give us wider context, wider Pacific, wider global context, is exactly that point. Is exactly around, you know, us in this world, Te Ao Marama, this world of light, connecting in the way that our tupuna ancestors are constantly in connection. And so, and also, I think for us here in Aotearoa, is us also understanding our context in the wider colonial acts of imperialism within the world, and understanding that not only was it about them coming here and dispossessing and implanting violence amongst our communities, but also the violent forced removals and the violent, you know, stealing of bodies and the violent enslavement of ancestors, that it's a part of that bigger global imperialist project that they've continued to maintain and reproduce through generations. And it's really important for us here to hear that, to hear these stories and to know those histories. So we do have a question here from Charlotte. And Charlotte asks, social justice cannot be found in the criminal justice systems. Can you talk a little bit more about this, please?
Yes. So I should just upfront say that I am a prison abolitionist. So I'm like 100% defund the police. So I'm not objective about this. I just need to own that. I think the roots of the criminal justice system are in criminalizing working class communities on these islands and criminalizing indigenous folk, criminalizing, you know, like folk that have been trafficked, criminalizing folk seeking to escape the plantation economy, etc. When you look at like the class, you know, the politics of class, even in the kind of European space, you know, the whole idea of a criminal underclass is a fundamental part of how the adversarial criminal justice system has been established. And so, like, for me, like, I believe in accountability 100%. I'm not kind of saying that I'm fluffy about this. I'm not, you know, I'm not interested in violent men not being held to account and so forth. But I'm also heavily invested in healing, right? I'm heavily invested in how we start to reimagine, you know, or community justice or ways of working, not just in a moment that is about trying to lock men up. The same criminal justice systems are the systems that are locking women up. The same criminal justice systems are having babies born in prison. The same criminal justice system is responsible for our children being criminalized. The criminal justice system is designed to see anybody with a certain degree of melanin as fundamentally wrong. We can't find justice in a system that wasn't designed for us, with us, by us. We can't find justice in a system that wasn't designed to liberate us. The criminal justice system was designed to suppress and oppress us. And so therefore, it's not a place that I can look to for healing or for freedom. It's a place that in a moment of crisis, I might look to for something, because in a moment of crisis, we revert to what we know and we revert to what is familiar. And I'm as colonized as the next person. So there might be moments where like my default is to like, that's the thing that we've got and they need to do their job and all of those things. But if you ask me what my deepest vision is and my deepest hope is that we never have to engage with that system, because what I want is our freedom and or liberation. And so pragmatically in a moment, that might be the thing, but I might look to them for something in that moment, but it's not freedom and it's not social justice.
Kia ora. So Hawley's got a question for you. Kia ora, thank you for your kōrero. Can you please provide further whakaaro in relation to practices used to clear space for tupuna, for ancestors to be present? And I want to add and follow on from your previous answer as well, around cultural practices for resolution or for and dealing with the impact of violence. So that kind of collective, and Betty talked about a number of cultural practices and as have others who have spoken. So both that kind of notion of practices in terms of clearing space for ancestors, but also practices for that kind of collective responsibility, accountability.
Yeah, thank you, Kia ora. So the first thing is there's a deep piece at the level of and I say the individual carefully, but I mean like as we know ourselves as a single human being, whatever that means, of reckoning and allowing for self-humility for ancestor to be present. So it involves a conversation with our own egos, first of all. Different communities, different individuals will have different practices that may include specific ancestral recall. So how we, for example, might open and close a space, how we may, what we call pour libation onto the soil, how we may name specific deities, and others not. So for example, I deliberately did not put a picture of Papa Legba up as like that's like an important thing, because to use an image of Papa Legba is to invite him into the space to have us all spin in the crossroads, and actually like literally his work is to create chaos, right? And he's a trickster. So it's also deepening our relationship and our, in Rasta we would say, or understanding of who our ancestors were and are, and who our deities are. It's understanding our cosmologies more deeply, and in doing so, like we start to kind of rebuild and reimagine the practices. For many of us were raised in church. You know, like many of us have the experience. So, you know, this is a Betty and I laugh about it all the time. Like I can start a hymn off and Betty can finish it, right? Like literally we so like, you know, get the guitar out, guitar or no, like how we were raised in different parts of the world, and we can know the same Christian thing, for me is an indication of like what a number colonization did on us. So for us, there's also something around like being gentle with ourselves with that. Recognizing sometimes the comfort we might find in a gospel song, and actually not dehumanizing ourselves for finding a comfort in that, while at the same time allowing our practice to deepen. So we're like, who was I before these people arrived? Like, what can I remember of myself? And I just also need to add, for me to whakapapa in terms of my African ancestors, with on one side, only recently I've been able to go back 7 generations on one side. That's unheard of for most of us. I've had to sit with plantation records. It's actually much easier for me to whakapapa my Scottish side, right? It's much easier for me to actually find my dad's dad who was born in Scotland. That's much easier. So the work of ancestral recall is work of deep humility and silence and reimagination. And sometimes we don't always know whether it's right, because the practices aren't always handed down to us in a conscious way. The practices are handed down to us energetically and psychically. Leonie, to speak to the issues around cultural responses, so much of what I learned in the space with Betty and the project, right? Like for me, that was healing, that was a gift. Dorette just cried for all the days that she was on the land, because she was just like, I want this for our community. I want this. I want to be able to do what I've witnessed and what I've been a part of here at the project in the spaces for us as African Caribbean folk. We don't have this practice in many ways here on these islands. I speak as a survivor of different forms, not just the colonial violence, but I speak as a survivor of sexual assault. And one of the things that felt so important to me even then was to be able to have space for accountability to happen at the level of community. And then I realized that my community did not have that training and didn't have the deep analysis. They had some tools, but they just didn't know what to do, right? And that would have been, with everything that had happened, with all of the trauma, and although like there were all of these emotions that would have wanted me to dismiss this human being, the thing that I wanted was, I wanted him to be held account in front of us. Like I wanted what I saw happen at the project, right? So I believe that is some of our deepest work right now, to start to build those practices, to do them in ways that center the person who has been harmed, right? Do that in ways that actually don't minimize or dismiss that violence. Do that with care and love, but also in ways that don't automatically lean into a quick solution. And in a crisis, you might need to keep her safe. But we also need to be thinking about different approaches, because the state is not going to fix this for us.
Kia ora. One of the things that we've been learning from a lot is from people like Bonnie Duran and Karina Walters and Tess Evans Campbell, Ramona Beltran, Native Relations from Turtle Island, has been around historical trauma, and has been around that recognition of the way in which violence becomes embedded within whakapapa, becomes embedded within our being, alongside all of the other amazingly joyful memories, right? Mm-hmm. But do you have any comment around, one of the things that's come up in our project is, in healing ourselves, we're healing our ancestors. Do you have any comment around something like that?
I might cry. Yeah, my comment is the tears. The part of the reason I said at so many points in my presentation that we've never been far away from violence is really acknowledging, like, I don't want to think of the African continent as this perfect place where there was no violence, because that's absurd, right? Like, we were human, you know, before first contact, right? But I'm really clear that the violence of colonization did something to us and continues to do something to us in terms of even the very way that we know ourselves. And when I invoke my ancestors at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean, I do so because they are calling on me to name them, even if I don't know their names. They're calling on, like, we have stories of, slave traders throwing hundreds of humans overboard for an insurance claim, right? I see it as my responsibility, 7 generations in, like the kind of ancestor the kind of human that I have to be to continue the work, to mourn for them, to grieve for them, to heal those wounds with the full understanding that that's a big labor. Like, it's big and it's deep and it requires all of us. But every time I cry and every time I pray and every time I do this work, like I have a marking here. 7 spirals. It's 7 generations. I'm accountable 7 generations behind me and 7 generations before that and 7 generations into the future and 7 generations ahead of that. And a critical part of that is the healing. The violence is, I don't want to say like the violence is in my DNA, like as in pathologizing myself, but I want to say the violence is in my DNA as a memory, right? The memory, the holding of it, the trauma of it. Like I feel it in my responses. I feel it in the fear that I feel when I go on the street here in London and I'm in a space that is mainly white. I have a visceral response which comes from that legacy and the fact that I am always in my spirit not too far from the plantation and not too far from that ship. And so we do this work to heal ourselves, but we heal ourselves and we're healing all that has gone before us. Like, I don't know another way for it to be, sis. Like, I really don't. It's deep. It's so deep. It's beyond what can be articulated in our everyday language.
I think that, and I was talking around that kind of embodied memory that we carry through and on behalf of our obligation to heal into the next generations, and that many people have shared with us. And we've been saying this for many generations, I think, as Māori, our not wanting this to continue into generation after generation after generation. And so what is our role in terms of that? And I think that it's part of the wider revitalisation. And I know that Matua Po talked about it in his webinar about his connectedness to his kuia and her role and in his life and the importance of that and the importance of that healing spirit, that wairua that comes with that. And so people like Matua Po and Rose Petty and others have dedicated their life, I think, to bringing that back to us. And and I think many people have been bringing it to the fore, and we haven't been quite ready, but I think that we are ready. We're very ready now to take it into another layer, where it's not just about us as individuals, but it's about all the generations before, all the ancestors before, and all the ancestors yet to come. So kia ora. So a couple of other questions here. Do you have any thoughts on healing for the person and the whakapapa lines of those who have both experienced violence as survivors and as perpetrators? So again, it's that kind of whakapapa intergenerational, I guess it's the intergenerational healing processes.
Yeah. I do, and I want to offer this as a space of complexity as someone with Scottish ancestry, right? And it's why at the very beginning I surface that piece of the or the acknowledgement of the hybridity and the forced hybridity, the violence of this hybridity. I find myself often in a very torn space. I don't have an easy, it's a space of uncomfortable reckoning for me. The acknowledgement of, quite frankly, the white folk who were causing all sorts of, you know, I'm not going to swear at the moment because I swear a lot, but the white folk who caused the devastation, and how to acknowledge and not remain permanently devastated. And whether my obligation with that bloodline is to also take responsibility for healing the harm caused by my white ancestors. It's a tense one. It's a tense one for me. I don't have an answer for it. I have a discomfort with it. You know, like you know, like my father's father was practically an overseer in you know, in Jamaica. So it's not that far behind. You know, my dad's sisters were not excited about the fact that him, as this light-skinned mixed man, was marrying a darker woman. It's not that far behind in my family and in my generation, right? So for me, it feels like healing that, but it is a really uncomfortable, painful space, and it's not one that I tread into easily. I think in terms of the damage of colonization, I want Europeans to actually, you know, like Eve Tuck, Eve Tuck's work around decolonization is not a metaphor. That's where I am. I'm like, this is not a metaphor. Like, y'all do some damn work, because you have like us out here working for ourselves and working for you and working to heal you. Like, I really want white folk to do some work around this. Like, I really want them to take reparations on as meaningful. I want actual compensation to be made. I want land to be returned. That's what I want to see. That for me is when I will know that white people are invested in healing, right? And for me, that cannot be my labor. Like, my labor can be to get up in your face and argue with you about it, but I can't do that work for white folk, right? And white people need to actually get together and have us stop laboring on their wine presses. Like, it's too, no, enough. The plantation, like, for me, I'm like, I'm done. We left, you know, and now pay us back. And it will take as many generations of damage as they caused to even begin to imagine what feels unrepairable, right? So, and that's for them to live with.
Kia ora. We have another question. Thank you so much for your kōrero. There are two films, Mozan, 1996, by Safi Faye, and Mulad by Ousmane Semibene, 2004, that speak through an African lens about issues you've raised about female genital mutilation and also child marriage. I'm wondering if you've seen these films and could perhaps speak to the significance of filmmaking as being empowering to discuss internal issues that deconstruct colonial attributions to misunderstood or weaponized trauma. I also want to add to that, because I saw at the very beginning you had the Benin statue, and we had Ngozi Onwurah here in 2000 speaking to her work. So I'm interested as to whether, with this question, whether her work has also resonated.
So, a couple of things. Mulade I've seen, and I'm having the perimenopausal memory block where I'm like, I can't remember the film, but I remember seeing it. Filmmaking, like any space of art and creativity, is an important part of how we tell our stories, an important part of how we resist. There's a reason why invaders will often go to you know, libraries and museums, and there's a reason why they attack our language and they attack particular things like, you know, visual art and so forth. There's because there's such power in creativity, and film as a medium, I think, is incredibly important. I think there is something about when also when we are telling or stories in diverse ways, like we don't have to agree on how the stories are told. That's also the thing. Like we must resist homogeneity. Like we don't have to have one voice as African heritage folk, as African descendant folk. Like Maori doesn't need to have like one voice. Like we're not, you know, it's again, colonization and resisting colonization can have us want to be like, or unity should look like homogeneity. No, our unity should be radical. It should be more like a choir or an orchestra, like where actually we have our different functions in it. So, you know, it's a radical harmony. And so whether, even when I don't agree with the way a story is told, I also appreciate the art, and I appreciate the creativity, and I appreciate the work that might go into telling that story. I think issues such as child marriage and female genital mutilation, again, are complicated by the ways that black female bodies are not afforded the protection in media spaces as their white counterparts. The way we speak about FGM, we don't speak about other forms of child sexual harm in that way. We don't show bodies, we don't show, you know, the genitals of white children. We don't put those genitals on display. We don't show white girls being held down. We routinely do that with black girls. So I think there is something around who is telling the story, how and why, that is also really important for me as liberation practice, right? Like, yeah, I don't know if that answers the question, but in the context of me not remembering anything these days, Betty, did you just say nope? I didn't answer the question.
No, that was to me.
Okay.
Okay, I'm just cognizant of the time, and this has been a really exceptional conversation. There was something you talked about around disrupting the idea of sector, and immediately I went, yes. So can you talk a little bit about that kind of disruption of the sector and the way in which you're creating more kind of focused kind of locations and sites and spaces, and how you do that when it's kind of really sector dominated?
Yeah. So, sis, you know, the sector has an important function to play on a day-to-day basis in terms of a certain reimagining. Many of us have worked in the sector, come through the sector, will continue to defend the need for the sector to exist. And the professionalization of resistance work has squeezed the heart and the belly out of much of the work, and has squeezed the movement out of the work. So again, the more professionalized you become, the more you've got to have standards, the closer to the state you get, right? And I'm like, I want to leave the state behind. That's not, that the nation state should be accountable, but the nation state will never free us, right? Like it's that. There's a tension in that. And so the work that we're doing is we're coming together as really small groups in sisterhood, and we are messing stuff up. Like we're literally like, how deep can we go with this? Like, and we're building systems of accountability. We are building, we're working in horizontal structures. We are just shifting the power dynamics. We are going, okay, you may have done this work for 25 years, you're going to still get paid the same amount as a sister who's been doing it for 2 years, because actually you know how you hold power through money. So let go of power. It's those kind of things where we are literally going, what is a liberation practice that we are engaging with now based on the future that we're imagining? So we're not waiting for the future to happen. We're bringing the future into now. And it requires sending trust forward. So it needs smaller circles of trusted human beings where you can go at the pace of trust, and you can actually be brazenly interdependent. Like where you can be like, I know this human, I trust this human. It's a bit like, if Betty showed up in a circle, I'd be like, I know this human, I trust this human, like this human will have my back, right? It's that, like, so working from that place rather than now we've got to get bigger and better, and we've got to be approved by the state. You know, Betty, I hope you don't mind me mentioning something about the project. Is that okay? You know, we've often talked about, you know, the project needing to do what it did and to take the money from the state. And the fact that the moment you take the money from the state thinks that it owns you, right? The state can tell you what to do. The state starts to dictate and direct. And actually, how can we increasingly ask the state to be accountable for that thing over there by going under the radar if we needed to do a thing over here? And that's the other thing. Not everything that we do has to be known in the public space. Like, it's really important to just be like, you know, like, let's be tactical. I don't want to say too much on Zoom, but let's be tactical. Let's be strategic. Let's not be like, you don't have to go up on the mountain and shout about it. Like, sometimes, like, our ancestors knew that, you know, sometimes you didn't need to tell anybody. Like, or you just needed to tell the people who needed to know. You know, and yeah, sometimes we're like, do you come in peace? Okay, you don't come in peace, you don't belong here. You know, so
right. I know. I mean, the notion of the sector is something that, you know, we've been dealing with for a very long time. It's that kind of you know, huge universalized idea, but like feminism, you know, that has this kind of already defined structure and way of being and cultural frame. And so we've been, you know, I think that a lot of Māori providers and Pacific providers like the project and others have been seeking to disrupt that idea for some time. And I think that we are beginning to see some movement in that. One of the things that came up a number of years ago, working with Ngaropi at Tūtama Wahine, or Taranaki, is running, and I'm really talking about when you just gave the example of small groups and being creative and having more intimate kind of spaces. One thing that Ngaropi is really, I've learned from her in terms of inviting people into spaces. So we ran a series of hui where 30 people were personally invited and were sent an actual invitation letter, not an email, but an actual, you know, something we really do now. And the invite, and I remember her describing the invite as being like a karanga. It's like calling out to people and inviting them into your space. As we call people into the marae, as we call people into those spaces. And it's a recognition of them, and it's a recognition of you and the kind of relationship that you want to have. And so I think it's a very powerful idea and way of doing things. And I think many of our iwi, hapu and whānau and community organisations are looking in that space. And so it's really great to hear your kōrero about that. I'm mindful that we're actually going to be cut off the Zoom in about 5 minutes. That's how it kind of works itself. I want to give Betty an opportunity just to maybe do some reflection for a couple of minutes before we close with karakia.
Yeah, kia ora, Leonie. Oh, malo lava, Marai. It's always such a pleasure to listen to you and to hear the stories, you know, and you know, it continues to strengthen that connection that we so dearly kind of talk about. And you know, I, you know, like we so learnt so much from kind of just speaking with you when you come to visit us and actually spent time talking to us about what we were doing. We didn't have words. You know, the project at the time didn't have words to articulate what we were doing. And so having you in our space and having Dorette in our space kind of gave us a lot of, it gave us these new words. It gave us, we knew what it was, but we couldn't explain it. So, you know, and today's been a great, again, continued connector. Your kōrero, your love for your people, your commitment to actually honouring our ancestors, you know, those things that are very dear and close to us. Malo lava, Loa Fionga, Marai, in highest regard. Love you, love your work, and looking forward to continuing. You know, this is lifetime now. Whānau, you're part of our whānau and always have been. And also just want to also acknowledge all of the ones that are on, that are here, all our people back there in the UK and across the Caribbean. Mālo lava soifua. And to all our sisters here, to tangata whenua, to Māori, to the tangata o te moana nui a kiwa, pa mālo lava le soifua.
Kia ora, Betty, and kia ora, Marai. Tēnei te mihi atu ki a koe. You know, our deepest appreciation and acknowledgement of you joining with us again on the cyberspace hui, and for your sharing, deep sharing. It's has been a really insightful and uplifting webinar. It's a reminder of the things that we are all doing well, and it's a reminder too of other things that we need to do better, actually. And the languaging, I think, was really important. And if you could send us the link to the book, I know you're not promoting the book, but you know, we really would love to be able to access your work more generally and to send it out to. We do have a very extensive list now that this will go out to, this webinar, and it's going to be really appreciated from many, not only of the whānau, but also the kaimahi, the practitioners who have constantly and regularly been coming into the site to look at the material. We do have our invitation to you to the October conference that will be coming. We really hope that you will be able to join us there in Ōtautahi and have some time again here with our people. And so I just want to close now with karakia from Matuapo that he gifted to Te Ao Māori some time ago to bring us back, bring our ancestors and bring us to bring us to a settled point before we close. But again, our appreciation and acknowledgement and gratefulness, sister, for your joining us. Kia ora. Kia tauna manaakitanga te mea ngaro ki runga ki tēnā o tātou. Kia mahi a te hua mā kihi, kia toi te kupu, toi te mana, toi te aroha, toi te reo Māori, tuturu whakamaua kia tīna, haumi e hui e, tā eke, mauri ora kia tātou katoa. Tēnā tātou. Kia ora.